Thank you so much, Sam. Hello, everybody. Jordan Elkind, I lead the product management team at Custora. On behalf of the whole team at Custora, I just want to extend a very warm welcome to all of the wonderful retailers here today. Before we begin, I want to put to bed the ugly rumor that I was given this speaking slot as a consolation prize after I flubbed my audition for the musical number. I was pitchy, it's true, that's on me, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed for a reconsider next year. So, me. Anyway, excited for kind of a rapid fire session with you folks today on a somewhat unconventional topic for a conference like this. It's all about using customer insights to tilt the odds in your favor when confronting risky business decisions. We'll start with a deep dive into risk and how basically it's everywhere and all around us. Then we'll go on a little bit of a philosophical inquiry into the nature of uncertainty. What is it that makes risky decisions risky? Then I'll talk you through a couple of pretty powerful frameworks for using customer insights to inform business decisions, along with some motivating case studies from some of our wonderful customers here. Then we'll leave time at the end for questions. So before we dive into what exactly risk is, I think it's probably intuitively clear to all of us that in the day-to-day life of a retailer in the 21st century, risk abounds, whether it's risk of bankruptcy, risk of rolling out a high-stakes new policy, like accepting your competitors' merchandise returns, risk associated with geopolitical events. All of these are things that keep us up at night. And so before I talk any more about what exactly risk is and why it matters, let me flip it over to you. I'd like to do a little bit of quick polling. First, do you spend more time thinking about the upside or the downside in your business? Okay, the optimists are coming in late here. Okay, this is great, 50-50. I like that we have a balance of the greed and fear sides of our brain in this room. Okay, second question. If you are somebody for whom risk weighs on you on a daily basis, you spend time thinking about the things that might tank your business, which risk factors actually bother you the most? Is it performance risk, so the risk of not hitting your financial targets, liquidity risk, like we're going to run out of cash, regulatory risk, like data protection, reputational risk, like we're going to embarrass ourselves on social media, technology risk, we have a very complicated tech stack, the pieces might not interweave together, other, or you're totally risk-free, in which case, meet me after and I'll have what you're having. Okay. This is great. So largely performance and reputational risk. Really interesting. I'm surprised not more technology risk given the number of marketing analytics folks in the room. Let me give you my quick perspective on why we're here, why I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. In conferences like Karma, it is so fun and easy to get caught up in this heady excitement about the art of the possible. All of the great new applications of customer insights to drive growth, the agile marketing war room, this is courtesy of our friends at McKinsey, building a test and learn culture. And for the record, these things are all laudable and 100% correct, and we should be doing all of those. But when we find ourselves in conversation with retailers, what always surprises us is the thoughts that they tend to voice, the anxieties around the future, tend to focus more on minimizing or at least mitigating these big, hairy, ambiguous, existential risks to their business. Things that are difficult to reconcile with some of this excitement around test and learn. Hugely impactful decisions like, should we launch a new loyalty program, something that can be very costly to the business over the long run? Should we invest in building out the supply chain, the marketing infrastructure, the real estate footprint to launch an entirely new market overseas? We have this very expensive real estate footprint at the same time that foot traffic is in decline all across the retail industry. Can we go ahead and close some of our store locations without tanking customer demand? Tough questions. These questions all have three things in common, which make them a little different from the types of things that we tend to grapple with in conferences like this. For one thing, almost definitionally, these tend to deal with entirely new ground, things that we haven't tried in the past. So if we're thinking about launching in Korea, chances are that we don't currently operate in Korea, which means that any historical data that we have on performance is likely to be of limited relevance or applicability. So really hard to build a reliable historical reference point. Ooh, these things are tough to test. So we're the biggest, most vocal fans of the controlled randomized testing framework. At Custora, we talk a lot about experimental design. Unfortunately, part of the reason that these decisions are so darn difficult is that they're just impossible, or at least infeasible to test. So as much as we might like to test the impact of closing, let's say, our Woodbury Common outlet by keeping the store open only on alternating days, such a thing isn't generally possible in the real world. And then finally, these are decisions often where it's really difficult to dip your toe in the water. It's kind of a dive in head first sort of thing. The decisions are often difficult, costly, embarrassing to reverse. If you think about rolling out a new policy, commitment to accepting your competitors' merchandise returns, that's going to be something that's very, very difficult to unwind if it doesn't work out after the fact. So I hear myself talking, and I sound like kind of a bummer. The good news is it's not all doom and gloom. We've had the incredible opportunity over the last 6 months, particularly, to work with some of the smartest people in the business, retailers who are really at the forefront of innovation around the application of customer analytics to solving hairy business problems. And they've really helped us wrap our arms around a couple of frameworks for leveraging customer insights to fundamentally de-risk these sorts of terrifying decisions that keep us up at night. I'd like to share with you some of what we've learned from them, and I'll go through and give you kind of the principle, and then a couple of case studies. So we talked about how when we're facing these risky decisions, things that in general are very difficult to test, as much as we'd like to grab at a randomized control framework to understand the impact, such a thing is impossible. Luckily, there is another group of people who fake it all the time in the absence of being able to test things, and that is economists. They, for years and years, with complete glee and abandon, have been unable to run the types of controlled experiments that they would like, but they're really smart at sifting through the data to identify natural experiments and creating synthetic control groups in order to baseline the impact of an action. If your eyes are glossing over, quick recap on the principle behind controlled randomized experimentation here. The idea is if we want to measure the impact of some kind of marketing action, really what we'd like to be able to do is hold out some subset of the population and not give them that treatment. Same as we would in a medical trial, right? To be able to have a nice clean baseline against which we can measure the impact of doing something. What does this look like in the real world when it's not possible to actually set up a control group and we have to rely on inferring kind of a natural experiment or a manufactured control group? We spent some time working recently with a company that faced a very costly and risky fork in the road, which was whether they should continue support for their private label credit card. Like I imagine many of the retailers in the room today, this was part of their loyalty strategy, so a way of engaging customers non-transactionally, increasing spend, was basically issue a credit card under their name. As those who have a private label credit card in the room can attest to, there's a tremendous amount of complexity, compliance that goes into managing these programs. They're often quite costly. And so this retailer found themselves at a fork in the road wondering, is the juice worth the squeeze, essentially, to continue to support this program? And they knew that it was worth continuing if and only if the credit card led to very material gains in customer engagement and customer spend over time. Luckily, they had some data on hand, and at first blush, the data seemed to paint an utterly clear and unambiguous picture that the credit card was the bee's knees. When we look at virtually any metric, historical spend, predicted future spend, the behavior of our credit card holders was head and shoulders better and superior to the behavior of our non-credit card holders. And so kind of a natural, naive inference would be like, yeah, the credit card is totally doing its job. We should one up. Unfortunately, as this retailer astutely realized, there is this awful problem of customer self-selection. So it just so happens that the customers who have the most love for your brand and are most excited about engaging with you happen to be the customers who are most likely to open the credit card in the first place. So this could just be an echo chamber, right? We could just be seeing that, kind of tautologically, our best customers are, in fact, our best customers. Luckily, this retailer had a big breakthrough thanks to our wonderful friends up to the north, the Canadians. So due to financial regulations, this retailer was not permitted to market or issue the credit card to Canadian customers. And that actually provided a big unlock for them. Because what they were able to do was zoom in on the types of customers who opted in, basically self-selected to open the credit card amongst the United States customer base, and compare that to lookalike customers from their Canadian market, customers who were essentially the same behaviorally, demographically, in every regard that mattered, except for the fact that they didn't have the opportunity to open the credit card. And what they learned was actually diametrically opposed to what their initial inference had been. When they looked at the performance of the lookalikes relative to the people who got the credit card, what they actually saw was that the credit card itself was not driving a tremendous amount of incremental spend and engagement. And so they ended up winding down the program. This is an example of kind of having the good fortune to stumble on a lookalike group or natural experiment in the customer base. This actually happens more often than you would expect if you're keeping your eyes open. Another case study, retailer from Custora's portfolio, facing a challenge similar to many retailers in this room with a large extended retail footprint, wondering essentially what happens when we close a store. So the customers who shopped at that store, does their demand just evaporate? Are we able to sop up some of that demand by migrating them to other channels like e-commerce, to other nearby stores? And again, at first blush, the data seemed very conclusive, in this case, very damning. When we looked at the types of customers who shopped at stores that closed the year before they closed, and then a year after they closed, there was this tremendous activity cliff, which this is only slightly stylized. It was literally this stark. Right? And so the initial inference here would be, holy cow, closing a store has absolutely devastating impact on demand. We should, if anything, we should be opening more stores, right? But not so fast. Retailer actually, again, astutely started pulling on the thread a little bit and wondering, okay, like how much of this is causally attributable to the store closure itself, and how much of it is just the natural baseline of our business performance, the fact that we're experiencing natural customer attrition, competitive trends that are eroding our customer loyalty over time. In this case, there was additionally a natural kind of control scenario that presented itself because of the way that they went about closing down the stores. Fortunately, they had a really, really clear decisioning rubric that their finance team used with mechanical regularity to decide whether to keep a store open or closed. First order question, is the store passing or failing financial metrics? Think four-wall cash flow, EBITDA. If no, great, the store stays in business. If yes, we go on to the next node in the decision tree here, which is, does the store have an imminent lease event? Meaning, can we essentially wind down operations without breaking our lease and threatening litigation and all this kind of stuff? If yes, it's a no-brainer. That store is going to get closed. If no, the store actually remains open until such a time as they have a lease event. They're eligible for closure. And so when we were talking to them, we realized, wow, this is like another natural experiment buried in the data. Let's look at the types of customers who shopped at these stores that were slated for closure and actually closed versus the ones that looked just like the ones that closed but had to remain open because they didn't have an eligible lease event. And what we saw was actually completely counterintuitive and completely changed their mind about how to think about the impact of store closure and really business priorities. What they saw was that the vast majority, the lion's share of the demand drop-off that they saw was actually due to garden variety customer churn. So customers leaving for a competitor, dropping out of the category, moving on. And only a very, very tiny sliver was due to the actual impact of the store closure itself. So this gave them an entirely new data-driven lens for sizing the impact of a store closure. Also helped their executive team kind of reorient the conversation around the big glaring problem facing their business, which was customer churn. So principle number one, if you can't test it, fake it. Tool number two, it turns out that even for highly seasoned retail executives, it can be very challenging to harness retail intuition to answer questions like, what is the impact of XYZ likely to be on customer loyalty or customer spend? It's just too fuzzy. It's difficult to reason about something as broad, with as many levers as customer loyalty or customer lifetime value. And so when we started paying attention to what the sharpest retailers that we work with did, what we realized is that they rely on frameworks, in some cases simple frameworks, to help them chunk down the problem into units that are easier to reason about, easier to kind of harness your intuition to make guesstimates about the impact of future actions. Many folks in the audience might be familiar with a framework like this, if you're actually able to see the screen. It's a common toolkit used in retail and finance settings for basically decomposing revenue. So if we're looking at revenue for our retail company over the course of the year, we can basically decompose that into the number of customers who transacted and revenue per customer. Revenue per customer, we can then drill down and break into orders per customer and average order value, or AOV. And AOV, we can actually further break down into items per order and AUR. And while it might seem, and you would be correct to assess that there's no magic going on here, this opens up entirely new and much more productive conversations in thinking about how to size the impact of risky decisions that have yet to be made. Let me give you just one example, a case study with a retailer that we worked with that was on the brink of launching a loyalty program. Now, I'm only slightly exaggerating the cost to manage this program. Those who have loyalty programs, I think will identify with the fact that they have a way higher price tag than you would believe at first blush. That's the cost of the technology to manage the program. That's the cost of liability, like legal fees associated with all the ins and outs of administering the program. That's the resources and the people required to make it go, the marketing, the opportunity cost of foregone investments. For this retailer, let's say it was $5 million a year. And so they went through this really interesting exercise of what did they need to believe to be true in order to justify this investment. Now, they knew from the design of the loyalty program as it had been laid out that the primary goal was to increase the number of orders per customer. So really focus on transactional frequency. That's not the case for all loyalty programs. Some loyalty programs focus on growing basket size or driving new signups. But for this retailer, they absolutely had to believe that this was going to produce a meaningful increase in orders per customer in order to justify the cost. Now, as we were working with them, what we helped them tease out was essentially how much of an increase in transactional frequency they would need to achieve in order to break even on the program. And so we broke it down into a couple of different CLV-based segments. Looking at their low value, more infrequent customers, what we discovered was they would actually have to increase order frequency about 10%. So let's say go from 1 order a year to 1.1 order a year. And for their most valuable customers, their super high CLV loyalists, they'd have to increase by a much more substantial margin, 25%. So go from 4 purchase occasions a year to 5 purchase occasions a year. Breaking down the problem in this way made it much easier for them to reason about what would actually be required. And faced with this set of facts, they decided to take the plunge. They determined that this was a reasonable goal for them to commit to. But frameworks like this can demystify the inner workings of customer lifetime value and loyalty and make it clear what actually needs to be true in order to move the needle. The third tool is nothing new. I've actually been really gratified to hear a number of leaders talk about this throughout the day. But it's the smart use of qualitative data. I imagine some folks are slightly skeptical about this. This is a very data-driven group of people. And all of your concerns with qualitative data, we hear in +1, right? At least as practiced in many cases, it's super fuzzy. It's tough to know what to do with it, right? So what do we do with something as squishy as brand sentiment? It tends to get rolled into this kind of mush of the average customer rather than celebrating the differences in attitudes and drivers across different segments. But what we've discovered is that qualitative data, properly captured, meaning deployed to answer a specific question with a specific hypothesis and actually gathered and analyzed at the individual user data, can help provide this all-important why to help us understand what's likely to happen in the future and why is it likely to happen. Let me give you an example, again, taken from a retailer that we work with. Around a very risky fork in the road that they were facing with their merchandise assortment strategy. So this is an omnichannel retailer that over the past year had seen a real drop-off in customer retention. Diving into their customer base, evaluating the individual lifecycle status of different customers, they realized that they were essentially bleeding customers. So they're having more customers transition from active to inactive status than at any other point on record for them, which was really problematic. And we worked with them to do a quantitative deep dive, which is often the first step to answer the what. So what's going on? What are the key risk factors here? And they discovered a couple of provocative data points or insights. Specifically, the customers that were churning significantly over-indexed on being members of Gen X, so late 30s to early 40s, and people who gravitated primarily to their heritage style, kind of their core merchandise assortment, as opposed to some of their more seasonal or trend-forward types of pieces. This was actually a big light bulb moment for them. Because you see, it turns out that over the past year and a half, this retailer had very consciously pursued a strategy of courting millennials. And that had encompassed both their brand marketing activations, where they were spending their money, the types of events that they were sponsoring, as well as a complete revamp of their merchandise assortment, going way more in the direction of kind of undifferentiated basics to compete with Everlane, Zara, H&M. And what became clear in the data was that this was actually alienating their core customer, somebody a little bit older who actually gravitated to kind of their brand heritage. And so they realized the need to do an immediate turnaround effort here. And they decided to do what they wished that they had done the first time around, which is before taking a drastic course of action, like completely revamping their merchandise assortment, to actually do something as simple as issue a survey. So we're in the process right now of running a large-scale qualitative data instrument on them, focused specifically on customers who are at risk of churning, to understand how they can optimize their merchandise assortment to recapture these customers and win back their demand. So to recap, retail is full of risk. It is the existential state of being a retailer in the 21st century, that we're surrounded by it everywhere. And unfortunately, compared to a lot of the types of campaign optimization and decisions that we talk about day to day, traditional approaches often fall really short in helping us reason about the trade-offs when we're faced with a risky decision. These are things that are often net new to the business. There's not a lot of historical data to call on. We can't run a test. They're irreversible. But the three frameworks that I just shared are some of what we're learning from retailers who are really on the cusp of applying customer insights, specifically mining for natural experiments and synthetic control groups in the data, understanding how to use retail economics frameworks in order to sharpen your reasoning and intuition around the impact of future actions, and then qualitative data as a way of proxying what's likely to happen with the customer segments that matter the most when we take a decision. That's all I got. I'd love to turn it back to you folks. This is such a bummer after lunch. Sorry, but I hope that it wasn't all doom and gloom. Thanks so much, guys. Enjoy the rest of the day.